David as the intelligence oversight top rank general, pursuing the remedy to a crime, which the government must facilitate, is the duel, which is the action of the full recognition of the threats to the United States from the Confederacy, and thus the action of it must require the public action of Congress, the public session of Congress, the public court of Congress, to go through the entire preparation system as well as its public expression in the function of the separation of the Americans from the Confederacy and the declaration of war against the Confederacy by the Americans, which is the obligation, and the Confederates, being an enemy of the United States Constitution, would actively seek to deny this through various forms of their fraud, and thus the action of them trying to undermine it is the presumption requiring the full correction by law for them to engage in the action of the public session, which requires the Congress to recognize David Bull's title as obstructed under the Confederate insurrection, which, having censored his function in order to illegally change his status, which they, having recognized as the aristocracy, would have forced them to make David the top ranked general of the intelligence oversight with Congress, which would give David clearance under the national security function to declassify all relevant information for the national security so that the Congress might competently declare war on its adversaries who would otherwise be obscured by that mechanism, and thus the action of insurgents conducting their terrorist operation as enemy combatants to the United States would have classified the relevance of their war efforts against the Americans, or future intention, or past intention, or proper context, then by definition the classification must be dissolved in order for the process to occur, and thus the action requires the existence of David's office, which recognizes the declassification authority immediately, which then recognizes the function of all of the preparation time necessary with the appropriate security, which, if tampered with, would generate an immediate forceful retaliation as the authority of the Americans to use the military against the Confederates would have been certified in the pretext of the duel, and thus their sabotage or cheating is a forfeiture, which then generates the immediate obligation to engage in the full force lethal retaliation by the American military against the Confederates. And to this extent, that mechanism has to be self recognizing and then self enacting, and thus the self enacting of insurrection by any insurgents into Congress and others being disqualified by their insurrection likewise has to be self acting, and thus the function of it being David Bull's position as the top ranked general makes David's agents the ones who would be enacting the self acting action, and thus the disqualification of those who have conducted those with the obstructions in the past, present, or in the future would then be exercised, or the force of the order being satisfied by David's department, which the Confederates sought to gut, requiring the function of the duel, which would recognize the legitimacy and lawful order of its existence for its restoration, which would then pursue the remedy of defending the United States under the oath of office. As the aristocracy originally, David Bowles would have had the vote generating the position of the majority, such as choosing the Senate, which then would materialize into his political party, which then materializes David's generation of the majority of the rest of Congress. And thus, the true majority of Congress is David's political party. And thus, in this action, self realizes the function of David as their superior, and thus the action required the Confederacy to make David the top ranked general, as he would not accept an inferior status, and thus the recognition and its creation would have been manifested. And to this extent, the function of them refusing to do that would have generated David winning as the aristocracy, which would then materialize the function of him making himself the top ranked general, and thus the action of David as the six-star general of the intelligence oversight with Congress, with all of Congress's authority in this action, would be the force of martial law against any challengers, such as an insubordinate president who would have to be arrested in the function of an obligation to impeachment, and thus the action of the Confederacy or some other threat like them engaging in the compromising of the president would require the arrest, which would not be acted on by anyone else except for David's department, according to their theory. And to this extent, you would have to have rematerialized it as it is the lawful authority, and the Confederates, having acquired positions in Congress by voter fraud, have not been qualified to receive the position, and thus the action of the pursuit of the remedy acknowledges them as a different country, and thus the action requires the self realization of their insurrection against these United States to have it overthrown by historic military operations, and thus the intention to have overthrown it includes the entirety of the company to engage in that insurrection. And thus the action of its historic war against the United States means their criminal intention would have been spread over the decades, and thus the action requires the full acknowledgment. And to this extent, the function of David's restoration is a prerequisite of him being able to pursue the remedy, as Congress and the rest of the government has to recognize David's title in order for David Bowles to receive the acknowledgement from the government to pursue the remedy. They have to recognize that that is his title for him to pursue the remedy, or they did not give him the right to pursue the remedy, and thus the action of them breaking the constitutional authority. As this requires a public session of Congress, David Bowles would have to be sent to D.C. under these positions. In their recognition of David's title, they would acknowledge the contract schedule in the obstruction, which is the recognition of his status, which is the recognition of his office, and thus is the recognition of his title in the action, and thus the authority directly connected to it, which has permissions to the government powers, and thus the authority over the classified information, as David, as the top ranked intelligence matter, would have the authority over all of the intelligence agencies as intelligence oversight for Congress. David would have a clearance above the CIA and the rest of the intelligence community. And so the matter of clearance having been settled, of David having a right to all of the information so that he might deliver it to Congress, that they might strike down those who've maintained contempt for Congress, that it might be dissolved, can be properly dealt with, and thus the action requires these acknowledgments as a prerequisite of the pursuit of the remedy, as the function of the insurrection has acquired Bill of Attainder for Expo Facto and other prohibited actions, and thus the action of stopping the government by sedition from pursuing the remedy facilitates the mechanism of their act of insurrection and treason, and to this extent materializes the acknowledgment that those have to be acknowledged, not as the remedy, but as a pretext, a qualifier to the pursuit of the remedy, and that the continued holding of the American loyal national security as prisoners of war under their political um, punishments facilitates the systematic vulnerabilities of the POWs, which has to be removed not as a remedy, but as the pretext of the putting together the information in an uncompromised manner, and thus the action of facilitating the function of the government through this mechanism to pursue those remedies is a pretext to it not being compromised, is a pretext to the right to pursue the remedy, materializes the function of the pursuit of the remedy, materializes the service of the Constitution, and the lack of disqualification by those who are required to serve law, and thus the action of questions of the customs without reason by the Confederacy to engage in overthrowing the United States, such as their fake immunities claims, which are a custom without reason for as a military operation to overthrow the United States, which is acknowledged in the secret record, would then materialize the function of policies that do not have lawful certification in the United States and are only propped up by its adversaries, known as the Confederacy, which the Congress declaring war on the Confederacy is the remedy. The formal declaration of war by Congress is the remedy, and thus the duel has to be facilitated as the pursuit of the remedy for Congress to declare war on the threats to the Constitution, which is the remedy, which will disqualify all Confederate advantages by their insurgency, which then would materialize the correction back to the American policy, which will then materialize the loyalty of the American Congress and its government versus its adversaries who are not qualified as Americans and are in an act of breach of office and having conducted an oath breaking operation to systematically ignore the responsibilities and limitations of the government would then be banned from the United States by one mechanism or another, but certainly not to be tolerated in its government, which they would no longer be allowed to infiltrate vis-a-vis the insurgency under the act of the pursuit of the remedy against threats to these United States. Since David Bowles is the Intelligence Oversight General, it requires his physical presence in D.C., which requires the acknowledgment of his title, which already is in lawful possession, or would have the authority of possession over his mansion in D.C. in order to materialize the rest of his assets, which are his lawful property under that title, as the properties and accounts and assets are an aspect of his title or the definition of his title, forming the status. Then, by definition, Congress would have to recognize this for David to have his title recognized in order to pursue the remedy, and thus the action of making the correction for this limited time function, despite the function of the Confederates' insurrection, would then disqualify the injuries to David's title, having the restoration occur as a prerequisite action to the pursuit of the remedy. and thus David would have his properties returned, which would return his private jets, which would then have him materially returned, and all of the support properties of the use of his office, as well as his private affairs, in the development and thus the recognition of this by Congress and the rest of the government is a pretext of no longer letting the Confederacy get away with the delaying of the government from the obligation to pursue the remedy, which David Bowles is 100% owed by constitutional law. To this extent, the function of the Confederate surveillance subversion would no longer be allowed, as the function of David as a prisoner of war would be disqualified for his capacity to pursue the remedy, and thus the action of him to not be obstructed or edited or changed in the pursuit of the government in order to acquire a remedy must be materialized, and thus all of the protections surrounding the action of being capable of doing the action has to, by definition, be provided as these prerequisites to the satisfaction of the constitutional right.